welcome to the virtual Sunday service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Lake Norman. Our fellowship walks diverse paths to find meaning and purpose, but we are united by our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all, and by the commitment to express our faith through acts of justice and compassion. My name is Sandy McFeely, and I've been an active member of this congregation since 2013. Before every Sunday service and most other UU activities, we light a chalice, pre-lit today to avoid awkwardness. Our chalice lighting words are from Christine Robinson. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. Today, our minister, Pat Jobe, will be talking to us about two brothers who held public office in the early 1960s. One elected, the other appointed by the one elected. You guessed it, Jack and Bobby Kennedy. They helped bend the arc of the universe a bit more toward justice than your average president and attorney general. One was poetic and political and glamorous. The other was pragmatic and pushy. They made a great team. I didn't realize at the time how very lucky I was, but when Jack Kennedy was in office, he held weekly press conferences in the State Department auditorium. Not even a hint of helicopter noise. Back then I was a wee summer intern and was allowed, even encouraged, to sit in on those press conferences. What an experience. To get ourselves ready to absorb all we'll learn from Reverend Pat, let's consider a quote from George Bernard Shaw that all three Kennedy brothers used on a number of occasions. John Kennedy, speaking before the Irish Parliament in the summer of 1963, was the first to quote this from Shaw and saying, "Some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and say, why not?" 5 years later, Bobby Kennedy used it frequently during his 1968 campaign for president. In May of that same year, with sadness, Senator Ted Kennedy also used it at Robert's funeral. At the conclusion of Reverend Pat's sermon, Mike Alec will share a musical reflection with us.
John and Robert Kennedy left an impression on politics and government for the generation that knew them. While they were very different, especially in the closing months of Robert's life, they stand as a pair of iconic Democrats. Good guys, for the most part, although certainly full of human foibles that remind us all our national leaders are human beings. The older of the two brothers, born May 29, 1917, was assassinated on this date 57 years ago today. Those of us who can remember it so clearly, the national grief, the state funeral, little John saluting his father's casket as it rolled past him on a horse-drawn caisson, those of us who can remember all that are a little amazed and perhaps a bit unsettled that it has been 57 years. It remains etched and seared into our memories. But the older brother is also associated with much that is cherished by Unitarian Universalist congregations. Although his support is sometimes seen as too little, too late, he is remembered as being for the civil rights movement and for advocating the Civil Rights Bill that passed in 1964 after his death. He is also remembered for founding the Peace Corps and the unbridled enthusiasm that surrounded that effort as development and kindness in so many so-called developed countries. When the Kennedy brothers were struggling to federalize efforts to support civil rights, to bring the Justice Department and its FBI into solidarity with Dr. King, Unitarian Universalists were marching with Dr. King. registering voters, in at least 2 cases, giving their last full measure of devotion. Both the Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo were killed by the Klan around the Selma March. A second UU minister, the Reverend Clark Olson, was attacked by the Klan and credited Reeb with saving his life by using his own body to shield Olson from the blows of the Klansmen. So the bonds between UUism and the Kennedy brothers were strong. While politics is not the end-all and the be-all, not nearly as important as personal integrity, for example, the last 4 years have definitely dispelled the myth that politics doesn't matter. Elected officials have a tremendous impact on issues of justice, fairness, environmental quality, and a longer list of matters of importance. Here's just one example. In the last year of the Obama administration, 80,000 refugees were resettled in the United States, many of them from Syria and other Middle East hotspots. During the last year of the Trump administration, only 7,000 were resettled in the United States. For those of you who have lost track of the numbers, the Trump number was less than 9% of the Obama number. The president set out to limit refugee resettlement, and he did. Our hopes and dreams for the next 4 years include a reasonable, humane, dare we even think it, loving refugee policy. Let's take just a moment to consider so many of our hopes and dreams of the past 57 years and how they've been tied to a deeply romantic memory of the Kennedy brothers, especially Robert, or as so many people called him, Bobby Kennedy. Think about and feel memories of his travels through the poor neighborhoods of New York City, the Mississippi Delta, how he stood with Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King, even though his friendship with Dr. King was rocky from time to time. He is also remembered as a friend to Walter Reuther and the United Auto Workers. As a much younger man, he was seen as ruthless and ambitious in his work as a Senate lawyer, especially in the investigation and pursuit of Jimmy Hoffa. But by 1967 and his race for president in 1968, his heart had been tenderized by scenes of poverty and white supremacy that he became an icon of liberal American politics. Perhaps his most iconic moment came on the evening of April 4th, 1968, when he informed a crowd in Indianapolis of the death of Dr. King. Kennedy began his speech by announcing that King had been killed. He was the first to publicly inform the audience of King's assassination, causing members of the audience to scream and wail in disbelief. Several of Kennedy's aides worried that the delivery of this information would result in a riot. Once the audience quieted down, Kennedy spoke of the threat of disillusion and divisiveness at King's death, and reminded the audience of King's efforts to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that had spread across our land, with an effort to understand with compassion and love. Kennedy acknowledged that many in his audience would be filled with anger, especially since the assassin was believed to be a white man. He empathized with the audience by referring to the assassination of his brother, President Kennedy, also killed by a white man. The remarks surprised Kennedy's aides, who had never heard him speak of his brother's death in public. Quoting the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus, with whom he had become familiar through Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, he quoted a poignant phrase that dealt with grief. Even in our sleep, pain cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in its own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. For those of us who reject some traditions around a separate godlike figure, somebody in the clouds, this quote may ring true as it evokes the grace to be found in the natural order, grace among the stars, grace in our ability to breathe and feel our hearts beating in our chests, grace and love for family and friends, grace in the water we drink, the food we eat, the natural forces which sustain us. Kennedy delivered that night one of his best remembered remarks. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but it is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. To conclude, Kennedy reiterated the belief that the country needed and wanted unity between blacks and whites, and encouraged the country to dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. He finished by asking the audience members to pray for our country and our people. Rather than exploding in anger at the tragic news of King's death, the crowd exploded in applause and enthusiasm for a second time before dispersing quietly. There were no riots in Indianapolis that night. Both Joe Klein and Joe Scarborough credit that speech with getting them into public life, and a group of scholars rank it as among the most important public addresses of the 20th century. And it lives in us this morning. Even those of us who have no specific memory of the speech live in a Unitarian and Universalist heart and mindset that believes we may yet tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. So many of us, and I realize not all, but so many of us in this congregation lived through the Kennedy charisma and cherished their dreams. We ached and cried through their deaths and the loss of Martin Luther King. Many of us voted for George McGovern, and one of my classmates told me right after Joe Biden won that he had believed McGovern would be elected, end the war in Vietnam, and bring about so many of the anti-poverty, pro-humanity, pro-environmental priorities that the Democratic Party stood for in 1972. Our own treasurer and source of great one-liners, Tracy Grimm, recently bemoaned her years of footsteps, stamps, and hours given to the Democratic Party of North Carolina, which so often fails because it tries to be Republican light. That Republican light line is mine, not Tracy's. As we move forward in the months and years to come, we would do well to read about, remember, talk about Shirley Chisholm, Cesar Chavez, Walter Reuther, Martin Luther King, Allard Lowenstein, Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, Bella Abzug, Barbara Jordan, and dozens more who risked the well-being and peace of their friends and family to work in the public life against those who do not believe we can tame savagery and make gentle the life of the world. Those on the other side can often talk a well-meaning game, but they will sell their souls to the corporate bottom line and a military-industrial worldview that Eisenhower warned us would be a disastrous rise in misplaced power. We see that misplaced power tragically today across the Middle East, and most woefully in Yemen, where children and adults are dying of starvation because of a blockade supported by the United States military. Just a few days ago, the United Nations warned that 80% of Yemen's population is threatened with starvation. Let's keep this conversation going. How wonderful that Robert Kennedy stood before 2,500 people in Indianapolis and begged for peace, love, and compassion the night after Martin Luther King was killed. How horrible that just 2 months later he would be bleeding on a kitchen floor, also struck down by an assassin's bullet. How wonderful that big-hearted people keep going into politics and other forms of public life, many of them supported by Unitarian Universalists like us. How horrible that those on the other side would cage children, mock disabled people, encourage white supremacy, and otherwise stir the pots of hatred and inhumanity. There's a part of us that wants to give up, to stop giving our money, our footsteps, our stamps, and our hours to causes that sometimes fail. But there is another part of us that can't give up. We'll never give up. will get back out there time after time because of dreams that were born in part in the presidency of John Kennedy and in the deferred dreams of his younger brother. Carry on, carry on. May be our most cherished orders, our best shared hopes.
Greetings, everyone. This is a song called Abraham, Martin, and John. Anybody here seen my old friend Abraham? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but the good they die young. I just looked and he was gone. Anybody here seen my old friend John? Can you tell me where he's gone? Ooh, he freed a lot of people, but the good they die young. I just looked and he was gone. See my old friend Martin. Can you tell me where he's gone? Ooh, he freed a lot of people, but the good they die young. I just looked and he was gone. Didn't you love the things they stood for? Tried to do some good for you and me. And someday it's gonna be anybody here. See my old friend Bobby. Can you tell me where he's gone? I think I saw him walking over the hill. Abraham, Martin, and John. Stay well, everyone.
Thanks to you, Reverend Pat, for your wise and encouraging words today. And thank you, Mike, for musically reflecting those words. And now for just a few announcements. We hope you can join us for a social and discussion time via Zoom at 11 o'clock this morning. The Zoom link and the new passcode are on the first page of the newsletter. The newsletter should have arrived in your inbox early Thursday evening. With the passcode, you can jump right into the meeting. No need to stay in the waiting room to be allowed in anymore. If you're a visitor to today's service, welcome. I'm so glad you chose to give our virtual service a try. If you like what you've seen and heard so far and are wondering how to stay connected with our congregation, please reach out to our membership chair, Linda Heidenberg. Her email address is at the bottom of the screen. Virtual services don't lend themselves to actually passing a basket, so we really appreciate members for keeping current on their pledges. And we are especially grateful for the gifts sent in by visitors and friends. We hope to be ready to operate at full speed when something closer to the normal life we can barely remember resumes. The mailing address for your gifts is at the bottom of the screen or in our newsletter. Now, I've mentioned the newsletter several times. If you aren't getting it in your inbox every Thursday, please let Linda Heidenberg at our membership address know about that. She can get it fixed. We strongly encourage members and friends to continue staying in touch with each other by phone, text, email, or whatever social media you use. These are terrible and anxiety-filled times, and hearing a familiar voice really does help. There are deep bonds within our community, and now, right now, is the time to make that extra effort to sustain them. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us, and I leave you today with the hopeful words of the courageous Paul Robeson. Sorrow will one day turn to joy. All that breaks the heart and oppresses the soul will one day give place to peace and understanding, and everyone will be free. Go in peace.